NASCAR has been consistently inconsistent with their overtime system since its initial implementation. Through the years, there have been numerous rule changes regarding overtime and controversies surrounding it, and in this video, we'll take a look back at some of the most wreck-filled, drawn-out, and poorly officiated overtime races of all time that have left many fans wishing NASCAR would just stick to the scheduled distance. Originally, the green-white checkered finish was a rule exclusive to the Craftsman Truck Series, where in its inaugural season of 1995 and onward, NASCAR wanted to ensure each race ended under the green flag. That essentially meant unlimited overtime, similar to the current rule, but with a few minor differences, such as racing to the line if a caution was called on the final lap. Anyway, the original green-white checker produced some exciting finishes in the late 90s and early 2000s, and fortunately for NASCAR, none of those races where it came into play were needlessly embarrassing. That is, until the final race where unlimited attempts were allowed, in 2004 at Gateway, where the drivers decided to make each attempt count. The problem started with 5 laps to go, and with a potential first-time winner of Shane Hamill leading the way, the Express Motorsports truck of Jack Sprague cut a tire and got into the wall. Sprague, who won the pole that day, was out of the race, but for everyone else, a green-white checkered finish was in the cards. On that restart, Hamill got a good launch, but the second-place owner-driver Bobby Hamilton made the outside line work and got door-to-door with Hamill down the back straightaway, right as the caution flew again, as in the middle of the pack, Chase Montgomery got into the tent of Terry Cook. Both drivers went spinning, and Cook sustained race-ending damage, but on the restart, the top 2 drivers pulled the same moves as the time before, except this time exiting turn 2, Hamill pushed Hamilton all the way up into the wall, and they both crashed. The racing was getting a bit out of hand, and as the caution laps dragged on for the 3rd time past the advertised finish, it was Hamilton's teammate of Chad Chaffin who led the way. Perhaps the 3rd time the charm, Chaffin pulled ahead of second-place David Starr in the restart, but in a battle for 8th place, the 2 of Andy Houston mirrored the most recent crash, pushing the 14 of Rick Crawford hard into the outside wall and flipping him on his side. Now the race had entered unmarked territory, setting up for a record 4th green-white checkered attempt, with the battle for the win still between Chaffin and Starr, each of whom had only had 1 win prior. Chaffin once again got a good launch, and the field managed to keep it together until he took the white flag, but entering turn 1 right after, Starr closed in just enough to execute a textbook bump and run, sending the 18 truck up the track and out of the way. And making it through 3 and 4 without any problems, it was David Starr who went on to claim his 2nd Truck Series win for Spears Motorsports. With 4 green-white checkers and 14 extra laps, it was the first big overtime mess in the Truck Series, but in a PR dream scenario, it had already been announced before that race that going forward, all races, including for the Cup and Busch Series, would be limited to a single green-white checkered attempt. Coincidentally, NASCAR had faced a much bigger controversy earlier in the season in the Cup Series that led to the sudden change. Due to safety concerns towards the end of 2003, they officially banned drivers from racing back to the line under caution. But in the first superspeedway race since then that a late caution came out, NASCAR froze the field right at the moment before Dale Earnhardt Jr. passed Jeff Gordon for the lead, handing Gordon the win. After the race concluded with 4 grueling caution laps, the feeling of injustice was well expressed by passionate Dale Jr. fans, and NASCAR finally decided to bring overtime into the Premier Series. Although not everyone was happy with overtime either, it was pretty hard for a race to get out of control with just 1 green-white checkered attempt. So that's why in 2010, NASCAR opted to upgrade to 3 attempts before the Daytona 500. And immediately they got what they asked for, with 2 green-white checkered attempts in the 500.
Now I want to know who the visionary was that said we better try this 3 times, because once ain't going to be enough.
Then in the next superspeedway race at Talladega, they maxed out all 3 attempts for the first time. First, with 7 laps remaining, a long sequence of checkups and mistimed blocks led to Jeff Burton, Jeff Gordon, and Scott Speed all spinning through the grass. In the front, it was Jamie McMurray looking to double down on the big ovals after his Daytona 500 win, but the field didn't make it to the white flag before Ryan Newman got loose at the top of 4 wide and triggered a multi-car pileup. Following another long cleanup, it was still McMurray leading the way, and with his teammate of Juan Pablo Montoya right behind him on the restart, the 2 were able to tandem draft out to a sizable lead, but going down the backstretch, Jimmy Johnson slowed up the middle lane well before he was clear, sending himself spinning hard into the inside wall. On the third and final green-white checkered attempt, the Earnhardt-Ganassi teammates were forced to split up for the restart, and so it was Kevin Harvick who lined up behind McMurray and drafted both his own car and McMurray's to a massive lead on the final lap. This time the field kept clean, but in a perfectly timed move coming down to the finish, Harvick dipped to the inside of McMurray and soared around the inside of him to steal the win. While more traditionally minded fans weren't too thrilled about multiple overtime attempts, for the most part, a limit of 3 attempts prevented races from getting terribly out of control and still almost always allowed for green flag finishes. It seemed NASCAR was pretty content with their overtime rules over the next few years, but due to some massive crashes during overtime attempts that led to fan injuries, they decided to return to a single attempt prior to the 2015 Fall Talladega race. In that race, which was also the cutoff to the round of 8 in the playoffs, it was likely NASCAR didn't want a wreckfest either, and up until the closing laps, the only 2 cautions all race had been for engine failures. However, the second of which for Jimmy McMurray's blown engine came with just 5 laps to go, and thus the green-white checker was necessary. Prior to the caution, Greg Biffle led the way by half a lap thanks to pit strategy, but he was forced to get fuel before the restart, handing the lead over to Joey Logano. Logano had already advanced into the round of 8 thanks to his win at Charlotte and Kansas, but running in second place was Dale Earnhardt Jr., who was more or less in a must-win situation to advance. It was no secret who 99% of the viewer base wanted to win out of those 2 drivers, but before the race even restarted, a checkup in the middle of the pack caused Jimmy Johnson and Kyle Larson to both go spinning. Because there was only 1 green-white checkered attempt, that was apparently it, but as the cars had not yet reached the start-finish line when the caution came out, the officials deemed it was an invalid attempt. Thankfully for most spectators, Logano wouldn't get a free pass at sweeping the round of 12 races, and everyone else would at least get a shot at racing to the finish. Even Kevin Harvick, who was facing an expiring engine and playoff elimination if he pulled into the garage. Harvick just managed to maintain caution speed, and on the second green-white checkered restart, or the first in NASCAR's eyes, Harvick intentionally spun the 6 of Trevor Bayne and caused a massive pileup. This time, however, the caution didn't come until after the leaders had crossed the start-finish line, so the race was official with Logano winning after all, and Harvick still being scored ahead of enough cars at the time of caution to advance into the round of 8. So ironically, in a race that NASCAR changed its rules for in order to promote safety and clean racing, the finish turned out to be one of the most dirty, embarrassing, and controversial in the sport's history. As looking beyond the invalid attempt, no penalty was given to Kevin Harvick due to a supposed lack of evidence. With so much negativity surrounding that race, NASCAR changed their overtime rules again prior to the 2016 season, adding the overtime line and unlimited attempts to reach it, in complete disregard to the apparent safety concerns with just 3 green-white checkered attempts. Fortunately, though, there weren't any major overtime issues over the next couple of years, but in the 2018 Xfinity Series season opener at Daytona, the unlimited attempts clause was pushed to its limit for the first time. In a race that was already plagued by cautions, the field was stacked up 3 wide with 3 laps to go when Elliott Sadler lost control from the top 5 and went spinning around. Sadler avoided contact with the wall and was still in contention when on the ensuing overtime restart, the leader Kyle Larson failed to block Eric Almirola and caused a huge wreck in front of the pack. The newest overtime rule added late in 2017 moved the overtime line from the backstretch back to the start-finish line, essentially reverting it to the original green-white checkered rules with unlimited attempts. But even after a second attempt, the field wasn't able to complete a single lap, as Spencer Gallagher slid up off a push from Ross Chastain and spun down the track. Despite contact with the inside wall, Gallagher kept going with repairs, and on the third overtime attempt, it looked like Tyler Reddick had the race won, coming just 100 or so feet from taking the white flag before the caution came out for yet another crash. That time, Ryan Ellis got pushed out of line and overcorrected hard into the wall right in front of Kyle Larson. But just before Reddick had a chance at taking the white flag again, the yellow one came out instead as Dylan Lupton suffered suspension failure and wrecked hard on his own in the back of the pack. At that point, the race was already one for the record books, as it had taken the Daytona Xfinity Series record for most cautions with 12 total, and approaching the 5th overtime restart, it had broken the record for most overtimes in any NASCAR race. It was a total mess of a race and could have gotten even messier, but on the 5th attempt, following the extensive red flag cleanup from the most recent crash, the leaders finally took the white flag without incident. And coming out of turn 4 on the final lap, it was a drag race between Tyler Reddick and Elliott Sadler, who had come back from his earlier spin to nearly win the race. But instead, it was Reddick who edged him out of the line by 4/10,000ths of a second, creating a third and much more impactful record for that race, the closest finish in NASCAR history. Later that season at Talladega, the ARCA Menard Series also saw its closest ever finish, also at the end of a crash-filled overtime. On a standard restart, coincidentally with 2 laps to go, Sheldon Creed led the way as the pack spread out single file, and even took the white flag. But in ARCA, every race must end under the green flag unless of weather or darkness, so when Brian Doza shut up the wall coming out of turn 2 and then multiple cars piled up entering turn 3, the officials threw a caution and the race went into a 1-lap shootout. With fuel saving already a concern going into the previous restart, the extra lap was one too many for second place Blaine Perkins, as he ran dry coming up to speed and checked up the whole outside lane. Still, everyone managed to keep it straight until the backstretch before Sheldon Creed pushed Riley Herbst below the double yellow line and right hooked him right into Sean Corr, bringing out the caution again. But on the second 1-lap shootout and the third sprint to the finish, the leaders finally kept it straight all the way around the track, and coming out of turn 4, it was a dead heat between Zane Smith in the 41 and Joe Graf Jr. in the 77. The ARCA timing system was limited to hundredths of a second, so the race was scored an actual tie between Smith and Graf, and the officials had to look at a photo of the finish to determine Smith as the winner. The margin of victory was later estimated at 2/1000th of a second, but there was debate over it being even less. While that race and the Xfinity Series season opener at least produced historical finishes at the end of their long and chaotic overtimes, the ARCA season opener from that year only had one of those things in common, and I'll let you guess which. The problems began when a huge crash broke out in the final lap, leading to a red flag and a 1-lap overtime shootout. But after nearly 30 minutes of cleanup, the race was still well from over from a time standpoint, as on the overtime shootout, the entire 4-car lead pack came together and crashed, triggering yet another massive red flag cleanup. And after another miserable 30-minute wait, the spectators got to see Michael Self pull away from the pack all by himself on the second overtime to claim the win without contest. Following the many superspeedway shenanigans of the 2018 season, there were a few more superspeedway wreckfests in the years to come that reached as many as 3 overtimes. But in my opinion, the 2022 Wawa 250 Xfinity Series race at Daytona takes the cake as the most ridiculous of them all. Not only did that race feature one of the messiest overtimes in NASCAR history, but the post-race controversy helped it cement its place in history as one of the messiest overall NASCAR races ever, as 4 days following the post-race inspection, the winner Jeremy Clements was handed an L2 penalty for illegal modification to the intake manifold. So the win was handed over to second place Timmy Hill, right? Well, no, but the penalty did just about everything else, as Clements and his family team were docked 75 owners' points, 75 drivers' points, and 10 playoff points, and the win was deemed to not count towards their playoff eligibility. But that's not where the story ends, as the Clements team filed an appeal soon thereafter, to which most rolled their eyes, but as it turned out, they were in the right. The so-called modification to the intake manifold was unintentional and actually restricted power to the motor. So NASCAR overturned all the penalties and granted Clements a spot in the playoffs, which he ultimately finished dead last in by a wide margin after a first-round elimination and an L1 penalty at Las Vegas due to an illegal composite body modification. But speaking of controversies in overtime, in my opinion, the worst mixture of both in all of NASCAR came in the 2022 All-Star race at Texas Motor Speedway. In a 21-lap green flag run to the finish, it was all Ryan Blaney out front, who eventually grew his lead to nearly 3 seconds over second-place Denny Hamlin. At that point, the only complaint from fans was how boring the race was, but the officials made sure to change that because as Blaney was coming out of turn 4 on the final lap to take the win, they slapped their greasy palms on the caution button. All because Ricky Stenhouse Jr. brushed the wall.
The car that was in the wall in the back straightaway, there were only 2 cars behind it. They both dropped to the bottom and then cleared that car before the caution flag waved.
Oh my gosh. I don't know what to say.
I do, but I won't.
They threw it right before he got to the line.
But it is the lights. It is the lights.
Well, here's why the caution came out.
You see him up out of the groove, Stenhouse, and into the wall.
Not only did he barely make contact, but he didn't spin and stay completely out of everyone's way. And to add insult to injury, thanks to NASCAR's All-Star race specific rules, the race had to end under green, so Blaney got to line back up for the restart. except that he'd already taken his window net down. Obviously, believing he'd won the race, he was about ready to start doing burnouts, but rather than NASCAR just admitting the caution was an accident or a mistake and cutting their losses, they actually went through with it and signaled for an overtime restart. Typically, an unsecured window net would warrant a black flag, but at the very least, the officials went against the rules there and allowed Blaney to keep going after he somewhat stuck it back together on his own. And with all the NASCAR officials and executives biting every last bit of their fingernails off when the green flag waved, Blaney got a great jump thanks to his teammate Austin Cindric right behind him and pulled away to claim his rightful victory for the second time that night. If anyone else had beat Blaney to the line, it might have been one of the most fraudulent wins in motor racing history, but thankfully for the last ounce of NASCAR's officiating dignity, the correct driver won the race, and just the $1 million prize, by the way. While there weren't any major officiating controversies during the 2023 Truck Series season, there were quite a few driver controversies, specifically related to an overall lack of driver etiquette, which was put on full display during two wild overtime finishes. The first of them came in the SpeedyCash.com 250, also at Texas Motor Speedway, where with 7 laps to go fresh off a restart, Colby Howard got into Matt Crafton while trying to push it 3 wide into turn 3, and triggered a multi-truck accident. That incident sent the race into overtime, with the rookie Nick Sanchez leading the way. Sanchez, the previous year's ARCA champion, was seeking his first Truck Series win, and after winning the pole that day and leading all but a few laps, it looked like he was well on his way to do so. He survived the ensuing restart, and after a single truck spin ensured a second overtime, Sanchez once again held his ground out front, but coming to the final lap,
neither one letting up. Did they touch? They touch. Nick Sanchez gets sideways. He wrecks. The 38 Zane Smith goes around.
Yeah, and Carson Hocevar will be our winner. Carson Hocevar.
Despite a valiant effort at Darlington, the peak of overtime chaos that season waited to come until the season finale at Phoenix, where with 4 laps remaining and a battle for the championship brewing between Grant Enfinger and Ben Rhodes, the other 2 championship contenders got into each other to bring out the caution. Back with 30 laps to go, those 2 drivers of Corey Heim and Carson Hocevar were the front runners for the championship, but while battling for 6th place, Hocevar took turn 1 too hard and completely dumped Heim. So with that context, their second altercation makes a bit more sense. Regardless, there was still a championship on the line and plenty of other drivers looking for a race win, so the overtime restart saw some of the hardest racing all season. Coming out of turn 2, Rhodes pushed up the track and got into Enfinger, sending the latter falling back as the rest of the field somehow managed to keep it moving in the right direction. But right as the leader Zane Smith was coming out of turn 4 on the final lap, the yellow flag waved again for the spun number 77 of Derek Kraus. With Enfinger having fallen back to 9th place, his team decided their only shot at chasing Rhodes back down was with fresh tires, so he came down pit road all by himself in a final Hail Mary strategy. He had to make up an unthinkable 20 positions in just 2 laps, but on the restart, Zane Smith missed a shift right in front of Ben Rhodes, and suddenly Enfinger's hopes began to rise. There was yet another crash on the 3rd overtime attempt, but gearing up for the 4th one, Enfinger had made it up to 13th place and was hungrier than ever for his first championship, which sat just 9 positions ahead of him in a beaten and battered number 99 truck. While Enfinger came up just 1 spot short of sending GMS Racing off into the sunset with their final championship, he put together one heck of a run to conclude this video, because as of this recording, that is the most recent chaotic or controversial overtime finish. There will be many more to come, don't you worry, but as for this video, that is all I've got to say. So if you did enjoy this brief history of wild NASCAR overtimes, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more videos just like these. And until next time, peace out.